In 1935, America was still suffocating under the weight of the Great Depression. Cities like Cleveland, Ohio, bore the scars of an economic collapse that had erased fortunes and futures alike. Lines for soup kitchens stretched around city blocks. Banks, once the proud symbols of prosperity, had become targets of public anger and desperation. It was a time of disillusionment, fear, and opportunism, fertile ground for a new breed of criminal. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, still in its formative years under the leadership of J. Edgar Hoover, was far from the formidable institution it would later become. At the time, the Bureau had no authority to make arrests, no standardized firearms training, and very limited forensic capabilities. Agents were often recruited from legal or accounting backgrounds, with minimal field training. They relied heavily on local law enforcement, which led to jurisdictional chaos and delayed investigations. To much of the public, the FBI seemed more like a bureaucratic experiment than a serious crime-fighting agency. While the Bureau wrestled with growing pains, headlines across the country celebrated, or condemned, the daring exploits of gangsters like John Dillinger, Babyface Nelson, and Bonnie and Clyde. These criminals captured public imagination with their bravado, treating bank robberies like high-stakes theater. But as law enforcement focused on chasing these flashy outlaws, another kind of threat was quietly emerging. Far from the chaotic shootouts and bloody getaways of the Midwest, a far more calculated and methodical group was preparing to change the rules of the game. At the center of this operation was Charles "Chuck" Marshall, a former Army engineer who had grown disillusioned with the government after seeing firsthand how inefficient and corrupt it could be. In his early 40s, Marshall was articulate, educated, and unassuming, a man who blended into high society as easily as he could slip unnoticed through a bank's security system. Marshall wasn't driven by poverty or desperation. He was driven by intellect, ego, and a desire to expose the flaws in what he saw as a deeply broken system. For him, robbing a bank wasn't about the money. It was about proving a point. He believed the institutions that claimed to protect the public were brittle, outdated, and undeserving of respect. With the right team and the right plan, he intended to expose their weakness on a national stage. Joining him was Raymond Collins, a former bank auditor who had spent years studying the inner workings of vault systems, alarm circuits, and internal bank protocols. Quiet and analytical, Collins brought a precision to the operation that was rare even among law enforcement. Alongside them were two others, one a getaway specialist with military training, the other a communications expert skilled in intercepting police radio signals. Together, they weren't just planning a robbery, they were orchestrating an operation so seamless it would leave no trace behind. Their target was a major bank in downtown Cleveland, one that housed federal payroll shipments and which, ironically, had been used as a security model for other banks across the Midwest. The plan was simple in concept, but dangerously complex in execution. Bypass the alarms, disable the vault lock, and extract over $300,000 in unmarked bills without a single shot fired. The FBI had never faced a threat like this before. They were used to chaotic, violent criminals who left trails of blood and bullets. But when the Cleveland heist took place, there were no eyewitnesses, no alarms, no shell casings, just an empty vault and a question no one could answer: how? This wasn't just another robbery. It was the beginning of a confrontation that would force the FBI to evolve, or be left behind. The planning began 6 months before the first vault was ever touched. Charles Marshall operated like a military strategist, dividing the operation into phases: recon, infiltration, execution, and exit. Every detail was studied, rehearsed, and refined until nothing was left to chance. He and Raymond Collins spent weeks posing as insurance agents and repair contractors, gaining access to bank offices and restricted areas under the guise of routine inspections. While friendly tellers offered them coffee and polite conversation, they were quietly mapping electrical circuits, measuring hallway lengths, timing guard rotations, and even noting when the cleaning staff arrived and left. The target, Cleveland Union Trust Bank, was one of the city's largest and most secure financial institutions. Its vault was considered state-of-the-art, featuring a time-locked door, motion-triggered alarms, and reinforced steel walls. But Marshall saw what no one else did: a security system built to stop brute force, not brains. On the night of the heist, May 19, 1935, the team moved like clockwork. They entered through a side delivery entrance, using a duplicate key acquired weeks earlier from a bribed janitor. A jamming device, designed by Collins, scrambled the alarm signal temporarily, giving them just under an hour before backup systems would kick in. Dressed in maintenance uniforms and equipped with silence tools, they moved silently through the building. Cameras, though primitive at the time, were disabled with black tape. Motion detectors, relatively new technology, were tricked using weighted ropes tied to ceiling fixtures to keep sensors balanced. In the vault room, Collins went to work. Using a homemade electronic stethoscope, he manipulated the time lock, slowing its mechanism by a fraction of a second every 12 hours over the course of several weeks. It was enough to eventually trigger the lock open 18 hours ahead of schedule, on the very night they planned the break-in. Inside the vault, they worked quickly and precisely, targeting only high-value, low-serial number bills, primarily federal payrolls bound for government offices across Ohio. No coins, no negotiable bonds, nothing traceable. They didn't ransack or destroy anything. To the untrained eye, the vault looked untouched. By the time the morning staff arrived, the team was long gone. There were no broken locks, no alarms had been triggered. It wasn't until a teller opened a specific drawer and found it empty that the theft was even discovered. Within an hour, a stunned bank manager was on the phone with Washington. Over $300,000, roughly $6 million in today's currency, had vanished. The public response was electric. Newspapers dubbed it the ghost heist, marveling at the lack of violence or evidence. The Cleveland Plain Dealer ran a full front-page headline, "Vanishing Act, Thieves Steal Millions, Leave No Clues." In the days that followed, reporters speculated wildly, some claiming it had to be an inside job, others suggesting foreign spies. Editorials praised the thieves' genius, much to the dismay of law enforcement. Inside the FBI, panic set in. Hoover was furious. The Bureau's reputation, already under scrutiny, now teetered on the edge of national embarrassment. The press demanded answers, the public demanded justice, but there was nothing, no fingerprints, no witnesses, not even a working theory. It was as if the money had simply disappeared into thin air. While agents scrambled to re-interview janitors and review weeks of surveillance logs, Charles Marshall and his team were already gone. No flashy getaways, no burned-out vehicles or abandoned warehouses. Just silence. They had executed what some would later call the most perfect bank robbery in American history. But what they didn't realize was that this silent act of brilliance had just awakened a sleeping giant. The FBI, bruised and humiliated, was about to transform, and it would never be the same again. The morning after the Cleveland Union Trust Bank robbery, the FBI's Cleveland field office was in chaos. Phones rang without pause. Reporters camped outside the entrance, demanding statements. Washington was on the line by 8 a.m., and by noon, J. Edgar Hoover himself had personally assigned the case top priority. Internally, the mood was tense, bordering on desperation. The Bureau had never seen anything like this. The Cleveland Police Department was the first to admit they were out of their depth. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no alarms tripped, no damage to the vault. Not a single eyewitness had seen anyone enter or leave the building. If not for the missing money, there would have been no indication that a crime had occurred at all. Hoover, furious, dispatched senior investigators to take over. He also did something unprecedented. He authorized an open jurisdiction order. For the first time, FBI agents were given full authority to pursue leads across state lines without waiting for local cooperation. The Bureau was under pressure not only to catch the thieves, but to prove its own relevance to a skeptical public and Congress. The initial investigation was riddled with errors. Dozens of bank employees were interrogated aggressively, some without legal representation, leading to complaints of harassment. The janitor who had unknowingly handed over a duplicate key to the thieves was arrested, then released for lack of evidence. Technicians scoured the vault for fingerprints, but the robbers had worn gloves and wiped down everything they touched. Investigators chased false leads for weeks, tips from con artists, mistaken identities, and crank callers claiming to be the mastermind. Despite the dead ends, a few small details began to emerge. One forensic tech noticed that the vault's locking mechanism showed subtle signs of tampering, microscopic grooves like it had been slowed down over time. Another agent flagged an unusual pattern in security system data. Several nights in the weeks leading up to the robbery, signal activity had dropped for short, unexplained periods. Individually, these clues meant little, but together they suggested a level of sophistication far beyond what the Bureau was used to dealing with. Enter Special Agent Evelyn Lake. A former electrical engineer from the U.S. Navy, Lake had joined the FBI just a year earlier, one of the first women with a technical background ever assigned to a major case. She wasn't well known within the Bureau, but her analytical mind and attention to detail quickly set her apart. Assigned to sift through hours of bank maintenance logs and electrical schematics, she noticed something the others hadn't. The alarm system's override function had been accessed 5 times in the previous month. The logs showed it as routine maintenance, but no official maintenance had been scheduled. Lake's theory was simple but radical. The criminals had studied the bank's systems over time and may have even run dry runs under the guise of routine checks. Her report caught the attention of another rising figure, Agent Thomas Gerhardt, a former military intelligence officer who had pushed for more scientific and psychological approaches in investigations. Together, Lake and Gerhardt formed an informal task force, re-examining the case from the ground up. They interviewed janitorial staff, building contractors, and electronics vendors, looking for any common threads. They started cross-referencing serial numbers of stolen bills with known black market circulation paths, suspecting the robbers wouldn't risk passing the money through banks. As the investigation finally began to take shape, one thing became clear. Whoever pulled off this heist wasn't just lucky or reckless. They were trained, meticulous, and deeply embedded in systems the FBI barely understood. And so began a quiet but radical shift inside the Bureau itself. What started as a scramble to save face was becoming a transformation in how crimes were investigated. The FBI would have to evolve, because if it didn't, it would lose the war before it ever began. By the fall of 1935, 4 months after the Cleveland Union Trust Bank heist, frustration inside the FBI had reached a boiling point. Despite dozens of agents, hundreds of hours of investigation, and national press coverage, there were still no arrests. The Bureau's reputation was hanging by a thread, public confidence was fading, and Hoover, under political pressure, knew failure wasn't an option. That's when he authorized a bold move, the formation of a specialized task force, separate from the traditional field offices, dedicated solely to solving the Cleveland robbery and future crimes like it. Officially titled the Special Investigations Unit, it was the first time the FBI created an internal team with technical experts, forensic scientists, and field agents working side by side. It marked a shift away from the old model of generalist agents and toward specialization and science-driven policing. At the center of this new unit were Special Agent Thomas Gerhardt and Technical Analyst Evelyn Lake. Gerhardt pushed for psychological profiling, a radical concept at the time, believing that the heist's level of planning revealed as much about the minds behind it as it did their methods. Lake, meanwhile, continued to comb through engineering records, wiring diagrams, and payroll entries, convinced the robbers had manipulated the system from the inside out. Under their leadership, the task force introduced new methods that would become FBI staples in the decades to come. Forensic document analysis was used to compare maintenance logs, revealing forged signatures and subtly altered entries. Surveillance of black market currency exchanges uncovered unusually clean bills, some matching the serial numbers of the stolen ones. And with help from early telecommunications experts, the team began monitoring certain radio frequencies for coded chatter, suspecting the robbers were coordinating across state lines. The real breakthrough came not through brute force, but through patience. A tip from a retired vault technician led investigators to an electronics repair shop in Chicago, where a young clerk remembered a customer, quiet, well-dressed, asking about signal jammers and timed circuit interrupters. The clerk had kept the man's name on a receipt, Raymond Collins. Gerhardt and Lake quickly dug into Collins' background and discovered his history as a bank auditor. On paper, he was clean. No record, no history of violence. But cross-referencing travel records showed he had visited Cleveland repeatedly in the months before the heist. His alibi, business consulting, fell apart under scrutiny. Following Collins led them straight to Charles Marshall. Surveillance teams observed secret meetings in hotel rooms, discreet money drops, and encrypted telegrams. Using wiretaps, another new tool in the Bureau's arsenal, they intercepted enough coded communication to confirm the operation's structure and membership. In early January 1936, the FBI moved in. The takedown was swift and silent, just like the robbery itself. Marshall and Collins were arrested in Chicago during a staged business meeting. Their two accomplices, both in other cities, were detained within 48 hours. No shots were fired, no escape attempts. It was as if they knew the game was over. Inside Marshall's briefcase, agents found blueprints, handwritten notes detailing bank procedures, and a journal that read less like a confession and more like a thesis on exploiting institutional weaknesses. It was a masterclass in criminal planning. The arrests shocked the nation. These were not gangsters in trench coats or bank robbers with revolvers. They were clean-cut, educated men who had used their knowledge, not violence, to commit one of the most audacious crimes in American history. But in capturing them, the FBI had done something just as important. It had reinvented itself. The task force model, the scientific tools, the psychological insight, all of it would become standard practice in future investigations. The robbers had exposed the Bureau's weaknesses, but they also forced it to evolve, and that evolution was just beginning. The trial of Charles Marshall and his crew began in the spring of 1936 and drew national attention from the start. Courtrooms filled with journalists, curious citizens, and even law enforcement officers from across the country, hoping to understand how four seemingly ordinary men had pulled off one of the most sophisticated crimes in American history. The evidence presented was meticulous. The prosecution, led by federal attorneys armed with hundreds of pages of wiretap transcripts, surveillance reports, and forensic documents, painted a picture of cold, calculated brilliance. Evelyn Lake testified about the alarm overrides and time lock tampering. Agent Gerhardt explained how psychological profiling had guided the investigation. It was the first time many Americans heard terms like forensic signal analysis or behavioral pattern modeling used in a courtroom. Charles Marshall remained calm throughout the proceedings, almost detached. When he spoke, he sounded less like a criminal and more like a philosopher, describing the heist as an experiment in systemic vulnerability and calling the banking system an illusion of security built on repetition, not resilience. His defense team tried to argue that no one had been hurt, no weapons used, and that the crime was nonviolent protest. But the jury didn't buy it. All four men were convicted on federal conspiracy, grand larceny, and interstate fraud charges. Marshall and Collins received 30-year sentences in Leavenworth Penitentiary. The two accomplices received slightly less, owing to their cooperation during the investigation. None of the stolen money, still totaling over $150,000, was ever recovered. Authorities believe it was carefully laundered through shell companies and foreign exchanges before the arrests. But while the legal outcome brought a measure of closure, the true impact of the heist was far greater than any verdict. Inside the FBI, the Cleveland case became a foundational story, one taught in training academies and referenced in internal reports for decades. The Special Investigations Unit that had brought the case to resolution was not disbanded, but expanded. It evolved into what would later become the FBI's Behavioral Analysis and Technical Services divisions. J. Edgar Hoover, recognizing the power of science and specialization, launched a major internal reform. The Bureau invested heavily in forensic labs, surveillance technology, and technical training for agents. For the first time, engineering, psychology, and even computer science would have a formal place within the Bureau's hiring protocols. Hoover also championed the development of a centralized criminal database, an idea sparked by the delays in cross-referencing bank employee records and currency serial numbers during the Cleveland investigation. The media, once skeptical of the FBI's abilities, began to shift its tone. Headlines no longer mocked the paper-pushing G-men. Instead, they celebrated the Bureau's transformation. Brains, not bullets, how the FBI outsmarted America's smartest thieves. Public trust grew. Congress approved expanded budgets, and the FBI began its rise into the powerful, technologically advanced organization it is known as today. Law enforcement agencies across the country took note too. The Cleveland case spurred changes in how banks managed their internal systems, how surveillance was handled, and how cross-jurisdictional cooperation was prioritized. More importantly, it redefined what a criminal could look like and forced law enforcement to think beyond brute force and into the realm of intellect. Looking back, the heist wasn't just a crime. It was a catalyst, a wake-up call that exposed not only the vulnerabilities of a single bank, but of an entire era of reactive, outdated policing. Charles Marshall may have seen himself as a reformer in disguise, but in the end, it was the FBI that carried forward the true transformation. One silent night in Cleveland had changed everything, and American law enforcement would never be the same again.